They would say later that she had commanded the very bones of the world to save them. They would speak in whispers of the quiet woman in civilian clothes who stood against the fury of a decorated major and the catastrophic failure of their most advanced installation. She was an analyst, a ghost, an anomaly in their rigid world of rank and protocol. He called her a rock sniffer, a nobody in his command post, right before his world and the mountain around it came undone. He learned that day that some ranks are not worn on a uniform, and that true authority is not taken, but given in the silent, terrifying moments when all other options have turned to dust. The air in Outpost Acheron was a dead thing. It was heavy and still, recycled 1,000,000 times until it had forgotten the memory of an open sky. It tasted of ozone from the humming server racks, of the faint mineral tang of rock dust that no filtration system could ever fully capture, and of the subliminal metallic scent of fear. The outpost was a steel and concrete tomb buried 2 kilometers deep in the heart of the Kalen Rift, a geological scar that split the continent's northern plate like a crack in a bone. The silence was its most defining feature. Not an absence of sound, but a presence. It was a pressurized silence, thick with the weight of the granite and basalt pressing in from all sides, a constant subsonic reminder of their entombment. The only permitted interruptions were the rhythmic, almost biological pulse of the geothermal exchange that powered the facility and the soft, sibilant whisper of the environmental controls. Dr. Eris Thorne felt the silence not as an oppression, but as a medium. It was data. She sat at a secondary monitoring station in the corner of the cavernous command center, a space she had requisitioned upon her arrival 3 weeks prior. The main view screen, a colossal slab of crystal that dominated the far wall, showed a rotating schematic of the rift, its fault lines glowing an angry red and placid blue. The uniformed officers and technicians moved with a practiced, lethargic economy, their faces washed in the cool light of their consoles. They were soldiers in a deep earth battleship, fighting a war of patience against the crushing geology and the phantom threat of an enemy that had not shown itself in a generation. Eris ignored them. Her focus was absolute, narrowed to the small, high-resolution datapad resting in her lap. Her fingers, lean and deft, moved across the screen's surface, tracing patterns that were invisible to everyone else. She was not a soldier. Her clothes were a statement of that fact. Worn dark gray utility trousers, sturdy boots, and a plain black long-sleeved shirt. She wore no insignia, no rank, no indication of her purpose beyond the severe, focused intelligence in her pale eyes. To the crew of Acheron, she was an enigma, a civilian consultant foisted upon them by some remote bureaucratic stratum of high command. They called her the rock sniffer, a quiet woman obsessed with the mountain's subtle groans. They saw her tracing seismic resonance, but she was listening to a conversation. The mountain was speaking, and she was fluent in its language of stress and strain. She filtered the ambient noise of the command center, the clipped exchanges, the clatter of a dropped stylus, the murmur of a systems check, into a peripheral hum. Her senses were tuned to a different frequency. She could feel the faint, almost imperceptible tremor in the polished concrete floor, a vibration that came not from the base's machinery, but from the lithosphere itself. It was a discordant note in the planet's slow symphony, a harmonic ghost that had grown more insistent over the past 72 hours. Her datapad displayed it as a jagged, recursive fractal of energy, a whisper of chaos blooming in a system that craved equilibrium. It was wrong, fundamentally, dangerously wrong. A new presence broke the command center's stasis. The heavy blast doors at the rear of the chamber hissed open, and the quality of the silence shattered. Major Kalen Vance strode into the room as if he were conquering it. He was a large man, built on a framework of heavy bone and honed muscle, his uniform impeccably starched, his chest a billboard of past glories rendered in brightly colored ribbon. His voice was a blunt instrument designed to hammer home his authority. "Status report," he boomed, the sound unnaturally loud in the confined space, a violation of the unspoken pact of quiet. Lieutenant Eva Rostova, the base's chief engineer and acting watch commander, straightened from her console. She was a woman who seemed to have been forged from the same pragmatic steel as the outpost itself. "All systems green, Major. Geothermal output is stable at 98%. Long-range sensors are clear. The rift is quiet." Her tone was clipped, professional, but Aris detected a subharmonic of weariness in it. Rostova had been on watch for 14 hours. "Quiet," Vance scoffed, the word dripping with disdain. He paced the length of the command dais, his boots striking the metal floor with deliberate, rhythmic impacts. He was a predator patrolling his territory. "This place is a tomb. High Command sends me to the most advanced strategic outpost in the sector, and it's a glorified listening post run by geologists and engineers. We should be projecting force, not waiting for the damn rocks to fall on us." His gaze swept the room, a judgmental scythe, and for the first time it fell upon the unassuming figure in the corner. He stopped, his eyes narrowed, taking in Eris's civilian attire, her complete absorption in her small personal device, her utter disregard for his grand entrance. It was an affront to the natural order of his universe. "Lieutenant," Vance's voice dropped, becoming a low, dangerous growl that carried more menace than his previous shouting. "Who the hell is that?" He didn't point. He didn't have to. Every eye in the command center swiveled to Aris. The peripheral hum she had so carefully maintained coalesced into a focused beam of attention. She felt it as a shift in air pressure. For a fractional second, she kept her eyes on her datapad, her finger tracing the final curve of a decay algorithm. The data had to be secured. The pattern had to be logged. Only then did she allow her focus to widen. She slowly lifted her head. Her expression was neutral, her pale eyes analytical, betraying no intimidation, no surprise, no emotion at all. They were the eyes of a scientist observing a new, somewhat loud, and entirely predictable phenomenon. She looked at Major Vance, cataloging the taut set of his jaw, the slight flush on his neck that signaled rising anger, the way his hand hovered near the ceremonial sidearm on his hip. It was a posture of dominance, a display meant to cow and subordinate. "I asked you a question, Lieutenant," Vance said, his gaze still locked on Aris. "Who is this civilian in my command post, and why is she not on her feet when a superior officer enters the room?" The accusation hung in the air, thick and toxic. The room had become a theater, and Vance had cast himself as the hero and Aris as the villain. He was asserting the primacy of his world, a world of salutes, of deference, of a hierarchy as rigid and unyielding as the chain of command itself. Rostova cleared her throat, stepping forward slightly. "Sir, that is Dr. Eris Thorne. She is a civilian geophysicist attached to this facility by order of Sector Command. Her mandate is to monitor lithospheric stability in the rift." Rostova's defense was textbook, citing protocol and official orders, the only language she knew Vance would be forced to acknowledge, if not respect. Vance waved a dismissive hand. A rock sniffer. Wonderful. Sector Command has a fine sense of humor. He left the dais and walked directly toward Aris's station, each step a deliberate encroachment. The technicians at the nearby consoles shrank into themselves, trying to become invisible. Vance stopped directly in front of her, forcing her to crane her neck to look up at him. He loomed, a mountain of military certainty, casting a shadow over her quiet corner of scientific inquiry. Dr. Thorne, he said, infusing her title with a saccharine contempt. Here at Outpost Acheron, we have protocols. We have discipline. When I enter my command center, you will stand. Is that understood? Aris did not move. She simply looked at him. Her mind, which had been occupied with the complex mathematics of resonant frequencies and tectonic stress, switched tracks. It now analyzed the man in front of her. Threat assessment, low. Ego integrity, fragile. Reliance on established hierarchy, absolute. Probability of irrational action when challenged, high. Her response would need to be calibrated accordingly. She gave a slow, deliberate blink. Major, she began, her voice quiet but carrying a strange acoustic property that cut through the tension, making it seem as if she were speaking directly into his mind. I am a civilian consultant. Military courtesy is not a required component of my contract. My work, however, is, and my work indicates a 94% probability of a significant seismic event within the next 24 hours, a manufactured event. She held up her datapad. The screen showed a swirling, chaotic vortex of color, a visual representation of the energy she was tracking. This is not natural harmonic resonance, Major. This is a targeted, low-frequency acoustic signal. Its amplitude has been increasing exponentially for 72 hours. Someone is ringing this entire valley like a bell. My standing up would be an inefficient use of the limited time we have left. A stunned silence followed her words. She had not just defied him, she had dismissed him. She had taken his performance of power and countered it with a quiet avalanche of data. She had reframed his challenge about military protocol into a discussion of imminent existential threat, a context in which his bluster was suddenly irrelevant. The flush on Vance's neck deepened to a choleric crimson. He stared at the datapad, his eyes uncomprehending. To him, it was just a swirl of colors, meaningless noise. A manufactured event, he finally snarled, seizing on the one part he could grasp and attack. You're suggesting an enemy attack? After a generation of silence? Based on your colorful little scribbles? He laughed, a short, ugly bark. Doctor, we have the most sophisticated long-range sensor arrays ever designed. If an enemy fleet was within 10 light years, I'd know about it. If a single infantryman was sneaking through these mountains, I'd see the heat from his boot prints. We have detected nothing, absolutely nothing. That is because you are looking for ships and soldiers, Aris replied, her voice still unnervingly calm. You are looking for things. The enemy is not using things. They are using physics. They are not attacking the outpost. They are attacking the ground it is built on. The signal is not coming from a single point source. It is being broadcast on a wide, diffuse spectrum and then focused by the unique geological formations of the rift itself. The valley is the weapon, Major. They have turned the planet into an amplifier. She lowered the datapad. Your sensors are designed to look for needles in a haystack. They are not designed to detect that the haystack itself is on fire. Vance stared at her, his mind caught between the ingrained arrogance of his rank and the chilling certainty in her voice. The idea was preposterous, a violation of every known doctrine of warfare. And yet, the quiet confidence with which she spoke, the clinical precision of her words, planted a seed of doubt. He crushed it instantly. To accept her theory would be to admit that his entire worldview, his lifetime of training, was obsolete. It was easier, safer, to believe she was a fool. That is the most absurd piece of pseudoscientific nonsense I have ever heard, he declared, his voice once again at full volume, broadcasting his decision to the entire room. You are a civilian. You are a guest on this installation. You will confine your research to your own quarters. I want her out of my command center, Lieutenant. Now. He turned his back on Ares, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. He had passed judgment. The matter was closed. Rostova looked from Vance's rigid back to Aris's calm face. Her own training screamed at her to obey the Major. Her instincts, honed by years of listening to the deep, mechanical heartbeat of the outpost, told her that the quiet woman was right. She could feel it. The hum of the bass was off. The floor vibrated with a wrongness she couldn't name but couldn't ignore. "Sir," she began, a plea in her voice. "Now, Lieutenant," Vance roared. Before Rostova could move, it happened. It did not begin with a bang. It began with a sound, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was not a sound that was heard with the ears, but one that was felt in the teeth, in the bones of the skull, in the very marrow. The polished concrete floor beneath their feet began to vibrate, not with the familiar thrum of the geothermal plant, but with a violent, sickening shudder. The lights in the command center flickered wildly. On the main view screen, a dozen red alerts blossomed at once. "What is that?" Vance yelled, grabbing onto a console for support as the deck pitched beneath him. "Report!" A technician, his face pale, fought to control his station. "Sir, massive energy spike detected, all across the rift. It's not on any known frequency. It's seismic. Containment fields are fluctuating," another voice screamed. "Structural integrity alarms on levels 7, 9, and 12. The deep hum intensified, rising in pitch to a grinding shriek that set everyone's teeth on edge. The entire outpost groaned, the sound of stressed metal and tortured concrete echoing through the chamber. A shower of rock dust and insulation rained down from the cavern ceiling high above. The world had become a bell, and they were trapped inside it. Vance was a whirlwind of futile action. "Activate defensive countermeasures. Target the source of the energy spike," he bellowed, his voice straining to be heard over the cacophony. "There is no source, sir," Rostova shouted back, her hands flying across her own board. "It's everywhere. The resonance is cascading. It's feeding back on itself. The more power we divert to the containment fields, the stronger the vibrations get." This was the moment of systemic failure. This was the crisis that protocol could not predict and brute force could not solve. Vance, the embodiment of the old way, was shouting orders from a playbook that had just been rendered obsolete. He was ordering his men to shoot at an earthquake, to parry a sound wave. He commanded the external gun emplacements to fire, wasting precious energy, sending slugs of molten metal into empty rock walls. He tried to open a comms channel to high command, but the air was so saturated with dissonant energy that all communications were reduced to a roar of static. Every action he took was not only useless, but detrimental. He was, as Eris had predicted, exacerbating the feedback loop. His attempts to reinforce the base's shields were like trying to dam a tsunami with a sheet of plywood. The energy he poured into the defenses was being absorbed by the resonance, amplifying it, turning the outpost's own power against it. The lights flickered one last time and died, plunging the command center into a terrifying, roaring darkness. Only the angry red glow of the emergency strobes and the individual battery-powered screens of the consoles provided any light. The strobes cast the scene in a series of frozen, nightmarish tableaus. The panic on the technicians' faces, the fine mist of dust hanging in the air. Major Vance, his face a mask of apoplectic fury and disbelief, his authority crumbling with the concrete around him. The main power grid had failed. The geothermal plant, the heart of the outpost, had been forced into an emergency shutdown. They were on backup power now, a rapidly dwindling resource. They were adrift, and in the heart of that chaos, there was one point of stillness, one island of calm in the storm of noise and fear. Dr. Eris Thorne had not moved from her chair. The violent lurching of the base had not seemed to affect her. Her datapad, running on its own internal power cell, glowed with a cool blue light, a beacon of pure reason in the red-splashed madness. She had been tracking the cascade, watching as the enemy's attack unfolded exactly as her models had predicted. The enemy was elegant, sophisticated. They had not breached the walls. They had simply made the walls irrelevant. She finally rose to her feet. The movement was unhurried, economical. She stood in the center of the vibrating deck, a slim, dark silhouette against the strobing red lights. The noise was deafening, the shaking so violent it was hard to stand, but she seemed anchored to the very bedrock, a part of the storm, not a victim of it. She waited for a fractional pause between the worst of the tremors, a moment of near silence in the roaring symphony of destruction. "Major," she said, her voice still quiet, somehow sliced through the din. Every head turned toward her. They saw her not as a civilian or a scientist, but as the only person in the room who was not panicking. Authority, in that moment, flowed away from the bellowing, impotent man on the dais and toward the calm, quiet woman in the center of the floor. It was a transfer of power as real and as palpable as a change of command. "Your countermeasures are accelerating the structural collapse," she stated. It was not an accusation. It was a diagnosis. "You are trying to fight the resonance. You need to join it. You need to harmonize with it, then invert the phase. It's the only way." Vance, his face slick with sweat in the red light, turned on her. "You are relieved of duty. This is my command. Security, arrest this woman," he screamed, but his voice was thin, stripped of its former power. The two security guards in the room looked at him, then at Eris, then at the groaning ceiling. They didn't move. His orders were meaningless now. Survival was the only protocol left. Eris ignored him completely. Her attention was now on the one person she knew would understand. "Lieutenant Rostova," she said, her gaze locking with the engineers. "I need access to the geothermal exchange controls, immediately." Rostova stared at her, her mind racing. Everything Eris said was counterintuitive, a violation of every safety protocol she had ever learned. To interface with the geothermal core during a seismic event of this magnitude was suicide. To do what Eris was suggesting, to deliberately manipulate the very systems that were on the verge of catastrophic failure, was madness. And yet, she looked at Vance, who was still raving about insubordination, and then she looked at the calm, unwavering certainty in Eris's eyes. She saw the data on Eris's glowing screen, a complex waveform analysis that, even at a glance, was more coherent than anything on her own console. She saw the only path forward that wasn't certain death. She made her choice. "Sir," Rostova said, her voice firm, addressing Vance but looking at Aris. "With all due respect, our systems are offline, and structural integrity is at 12% and falling. We have approximately 4 minutes until total collapse. The major strategy has failed." She then turned her full attention to Eris, a subordinate officially recognizing a new commander. "Doctor, what do you need?" That was the turn, the moment the hierarchy of rank was supplanted by the hierarchy of competence. The other technicians, seeing Rostova's decisive action, followed her lead. They turned to their consoles, their faces now looking to Aris for instruction. They were her crew now. Vance watched, his mouth agape, as his command evaporated in the space of a heartbeat. He was a ghost, a relic of a world that had ceased to exist 5 minutes ago. "Rostova," Eris began, her voice a rapid-fire staccato of precise commands, a stark contrast to her earlier calm. "I need you to manually bypass the primary coolant governors on geothermal exchange 3. We need to let the core temperature spike. Use the emergency shunts to reroute all remaining auxiliary power from life support and defensive systems into the primary induction regulators. We're going to turn the entire exchange into a massive capacitor." "Divert power from life support," a technician stammered. "We'll be venting our atmosphere." "We will have approximately 90 seconds of breathable air," Eris countered, without missing a beat. "If this works, it won't matter. If it doesn't, it also won't matter. Rostova, now." Rostova's fingers flew across her holographic interface, her training and instincts taking over. She bypassed safety overrides that had been hard-coded into the system, her actions a profound act of faith in Eris's plan. On the main schematic, which had flickered back to life on backup power, they could see the core temperature of Exchange 3 begin to climb at an alarming rate. "Jensen," Eris said, pointing to a communications tech, "slave your console to my datapad. I'm uploading a frequency modulation algorithm. You need to sync the induction regulator's discharge cycle to this exact waveform. The timing has to be perfect, down to the microsecond. The algorithm will create a counter-resonance pulse. It will match the enemy's frequency, harmonize with it for a full 2 seconds to achieve amplitude lock, and then invert its phase by 180 degrees. "Harmonize with it?" Jensen asked, his eyes wide. "That will double the intensity of the vibrations. It will tear us apart." "For 2 seconds, yes," Eris confirmed, calmly. "But that amplification is necessary to gain control of the wave. We are not trying to cancel it out. We are trying to hijack it and force a destructive interference pattern. We are going to use their own energy to shatter their wave function." She was not just giving orders. She was teaching them a new kind of physics, a new kind of war in the middle of a battle. The outpost screamed as Rostova rerouted the power, and as the core temperature climbed past every safety margin, the vibrations intensified horrifically. The deck plates buckled. A hairline crack appeared in the main view screen, racing across its surface like a bolt of black lightning. It felt like the mountain itself was being torn apart. The men and women of the crew held on to their consoles, their knuckles white, their faces grim. But they worked. They followed her commands with a desperate, focused precision. They had seen the abyss in Vance's failed leadership, and now they were clinging to the impossible logic of this strange, quiet woman. Eris stood at the center of it all, her eyes fixed on her data pad. The screen was a cascade of numbers, a torrent of data that she was processing with preternatural speed. She was watching the two waves, the enemies and their own nascent counterpulse, as they began to align. The core temperature alarm blared, a continuous, deafening shriek. "Almost there," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. "Phase lock is at 97%, 98, 99. The shaking became a singular, violent convulsion. The entire outpost felt as if it were being lifted up and slammed back down. The air was thick with the smell of burning electronics and superheated rock. "We're losing structural integrity," Rostova yelled over the din. "The containment housing for the core is about to breach." "Hold," Eris commanded, her voice absolute. She was watching the two sine waves on her screen converge into a single, terrifyingly perfect line of pure energy. The oral and physical violence reached an impossible crescendo. It was the end of the world. "Perfect," she whispered. And then, in a voice that was as clear and sharp as breaking glass, she gave the final order. "Now!" Jensen, his eyes locked on his own screen, slammed his hand down on the discharge key. For 2 seconds that stretched into an eternity, the universe seemed to double in on itself. The resonance became so intense that it ceased to be sound or vibration and became a pure physical force that crushed the air from their lungs. It was the physical manifestation of the two waves harmonizing, amplifying each other into a force of unimaginable power. The crack in the main view screen spiderwebbed across the entire surface. Major Vance, who had been clinging to the command dais, was thrown to the floor. It was the death agony of the outpost. And then it stopped. The cessation of violence was more shocking than the violence itself. One moment, the world was ending. The next, there was a silence so deep, so profound, it felt as if a god had clapped his hands over the ears of the world. The terrible grinding hum was gone. The violent, bone-jarring shuddering had ceased. The only sound was the frantic panting of the crew and the faint electronic beep of a few systems rebooting. The emergency strobes died, and the main lights flickered back on, weak and yellow at first, then strengthening to their normal, sterile white. The air, thin and tasting of ozone, was perfectly still. On Aris's datapad, the single, terrifying wave had flatlined. The enemy's signal was gone. Not just jammed, not just weakened, but gone, utterly and completely erased from the spectrum. By inverting the phase, Aris had forced the enemy's wave to cancel itself out. More than that, the resulting energy backlash, traveling back along the path of transmission, would have been catastrophic for the emitters. She hadn't just defended the outpost. She had decapitated the enemy's entire offensive capability in the sector with a single, elegant keystroke. It was a checkmate delivered with physics. The crew slowly picked themselves up. They looked at the steady lights, the silent consoles, the still floor. They looked at the spider web of cracks on the main view screen, the only remaining evidence of the nightmare they had just survived. Then, one by one, they turned their eyes to Dr. Eris Thorne. She was standing exactly where she had been, calmly looking at the post-event data scrolling on her datapad. She showed no signs of triumph, no relief, no emotion at all. She was simply an analyst reviewing the results of an experiment. The awe in the room was a tangible thing. It was heavier than the rock above them. These were soldiers and engineers, people who dealt in the concrete realities of power, stress tolerances, and weapon yields. They had just witnessed something that felt like magic, a miracle performed with math. They didn't understand precisely what she had done, but they understood the result. She had faced an unsolvable problem, a force that had brought their billion-credit fortress to its knees, and she had unmade it. Lieutenant Rostova was the first to speak, her voice raspy. "Status?" she asked, not as a commander, but as a subordinate asking for confirmation. "The cascade has collapsed," Eris said, her eyes still on her screen. "The hostile signal is gone. The residual harmonic tremors will dissipate within the hour. Restore primary power. Bring life support back to 100%. The immediate threat is neutralized." As Rostova and the crew began the process of bringing the outpost back from the dead, their movements now imbued with a quiet reverence, a new sound entered the room. It was a crisp, digital chime, the alert for an incoming transmission on a channel that no one had used in years. It was a channel reserved for the highest echelons of command, a channel so secure its very existence was classified. A technician looked up from his console, his face a picture of confusion. "Ma'am, doctor, I'm getting an incoming call. Priority 1. It's an Olympus channel." Before anyone could react, the cracked but functional main view screen flickered, and the standard military insignia was replaced by a single, stark icon, a stylized thunderbolt clutched in a gauntlet, the symbol of the Supreme Commander of Allied forces. The screen resolved into the face of a man who was more myth than reality to the crew of Acheron. It was General Arkady Volkov, a figure they had only ever seen in official communiques and historical archives. He was an old man with a face that looked as if it had been carved from the same granite as the Kalen Rift, his eyes holding the cold, distant light of a dying star. Major Vance, who had pulled himself shakily to his feet, saw the face on the screen and instinctively snapped to attention, his training overriding his shock. His face, already pale, went ashen. To receive a direct call from Volkov himself was an event of unbelievable significance. To receive one after the catastrophic failure of his command was a death sentence for his career. Volkov's gaze swept the damaged command center, his expression unreadable. His eyes finally settled on the ramrod-straight figure of Major Vance. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it filled the room with an absolute, crushing authority. It was the sound of grinding glaciers. "Major Kalen Vance," Volkov began, the words perfectly articulated, each one a hammer blow. "I have a single question for you. Why was I just informed by a system alert I have not seen in a decade that the Acheron protocol was activated without my express authorization?" Vance stared blankly. His mind struggled to process the question. "The Acheron protocol, sir?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know what that is. I gave no such order." The name of the outpost being in the protocol was a chilling coincidence he couldn't begin to fathom. Volkov's eyes narrowed to slits. "I am aware you did not give the order, Major. You do not have the authority to give that order. No one does." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "The Acheron protocol is not an order. It is a state of being. It is an emergency contingency that can only be activated by a single, designated individual under circumstances of imminent strategic collapse where conventional command has failed. Its activation cedes absolute tactical and strategic command of any and all assets in the theater, military and civilian, to that individual, superseding all other rank and authority. It is a protocol of last resort." Vance's world, which had already been fractured, now shattered completely. He looked around the room in a daze. Who? Who here could possibly have such power? His eyes fell on Rostova, then the other technicians. It made no sense. Volkov's gaze shifted. He looked past the broken major, his stone-faced expression dissolving, replaced by something else entirely. It was a look of profound, almost weary respect, the look of one grandmaster acknowledging another across the board. His eyes found the quiet woman in the civilian clothes, who was now watching the screen with the same detached curiosity she showed everything else. "General Thorne," Volkov said, his voice now devoid of its previous harshness, softened with a familiarity that was more shocking than his anger had been. "I assume the situation is contained?" The silence in the room was absolute. Every single person, from Lieutenant Rostova to the lowliest tech, froze. They stared at Aris, their minds refusing to connect the two words Volkov had just spoken. General Thorne. Vance turned slowly, mechanically, his eyes wide with dawning, horrific comprehension. He looked at the civilian, the rock sniffer, the woman he had berated, mocked, and tried to have arrested. He saw her not as she was, a slim figure in a plain black shirt, but as the architect of his humiliation, the ghost in the machine of his rigid, ordered world, General Aris Thorne. The name was not just a name, it was a legend, the ghost of Cygnus, the strategist who had broken the Cygnus X-1 blockade, not with fleets, but with a predictive algorithm. The architect of the Allied forces' entire modern strategic defense network, a system so advanced that most of the military didn't even understand how it worked. A four-star general who, a decade ago, had famously shed her uniform and title, vanishing from the public eye to work outside the very system she had built, believing that bureaucracy and ego were greater threats than any external enemy. She was a myth, a story told to frighten cadets, and Vance had called her a rock sniffer. Aris met the Supreme Commander's gaze on the screen. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Contained, Arkady," she said. The use of his first name was the final, devastating blow. It was a confirmation of a status so far beyond Vance's comprehension that it was like watching a human converse with a god. It recontextualized everything. Her presence at Acheron was not a bureaucratic assignment. It was a self-deployment. She had come here because her analysis had told her this was where the next crisis would be. She hadn't been sent. She had arrived. Vance made a small, choking sound and collapsed, not from injury, but from the sheer, crushing weight of his own monumental foolishness. He sank to his knees, a broken effigy of command. On the screen, Volkov nodded, his expression grimly satisfied. "A security detail is en route to relieve Major Vance of his duties. They will escort him to Sector Command for a formal debriefing." It was a euphemism for the end of a career. "The outpost is yours until further notice, General. Do what you need to do." The screen went blank, leaving the icon of the thunderbolt and gauntlet lingering for a moment before disappearing. From the shadows near the blast doors, two figures emerged. They were clad in matte black armor with no insignia, their faces hidden behind polarized visors. They moved with a silent, inhuman efficiency. They had not been there a moment ago. They were Thorne's people. They flanked the kneeling major, and one of them placed a quiet hand on his shoulder. Vance didn't even flinch. He was escorted from the command center, a man hollowed out by his own hubris. His departure so quiet, it was as if he were being erased from existence. A new order settled over the room. It was the same space, the same people, but the foundational physics of their reality had changed. The air was still thick with the smell of ozone, but the metallic tang of fear had been replaced by the electric hum of awe. Eris Thorne, General Eris Thorne, showed no pleasure in her victory, no acknowledgement of the dramatic shift. Her purpose was not vindication. Her purpose was the mission. She simply turned away from the blank screen and walked back to her station in the corner. She sat down, picked up her datapad, and went back to work, analyzing the residual data from the collapsed wave function. The crisis was over, but for her, the analysis had just begun. Hours passed. The crew, led by a humbled but efficient Lieutenant Rostova, worked to restore the outpost to full functionality. They replaced fried circuits, reran diagnostics, and patched the gaping wounds in the base's operating systems. They worked with a quiet, focused intensity they had never known before. They stole glances at the woman in the corner, the living legend who was now, unbelievably, their commander. They spoke in hushed tones, afraid to break her concentration. Later, as the alpha shift was ending, Rostova approached Aris's station. She held 2 thermal mugs in her hands. She stood there for a moment, silently, until Aris finally looked up from her screen. Rostova extended one of the mugs. "Coffee, General," she said, her voice steady. She had made a point to learn how Aris took it from the mess requisitions. "Black." Aris looked at the mug, then at Rostova's face. She saw no fawning, no fear. She saw respect. She saw a fellow professional acknowledging a superior. She took the mug, the warmth seeping into her cool fingers. "Thank you, Lieutenant," she said. Her voice was as quiet as ever. Rostova didn't leave. She gestured with her own mug toward Eris's datapad. "The cascade harmonics," she began, the words careful, precise. "When you inverted the phase, the destructive interference pattern should have resulted in a chaotic energy release, a burst of broadband noise, but it was clean. The signal just vanished. How did you know the inverse frequency would collapse the wave function itself instead of just shattering it?" It was not a question of idle curiosity. It was the highest compliment the engineer could pay. It was an admission of ignorance and a request for knowledge. It was a recognition that Aris operated on a level she could not yet comprehend, but desperately wanted to learn. A flicker of something that might have been approval passed through Eris's analytical eyes. She tapped her screen, bringing up the complex, beautiful mathematics of the event. "The enemy's wave was not a simple broadcast," she began to explain, her voice taking on the cadence of a professor. "It was a recursive soliton, a standing wave that held its shape by constantly feeding on the ambient resonance it created. It was elegant, but it had a fatal flaw. A soliton of that nature is fundamentally unstable without a constant, symmetrical input. By creating a perfect inverse copy and merging it, we didn't just interfere with it. We introduced a logical paradox into its core equation. The wave could no longer compute its own existence. It didn't shatter. It ceased to be." Rostova listened, her expression one of intense concentration. She was no longer just an engineer. She was a student. And in that quiet corner of the restored command center, surrounded by the hum of machinery, she now understood, in a new and more profound way, a lesson was being taught. A lesson about a new kind of warfare, a new kind of power. The next day, a sleek, unmarked suborbital transport descended into the hidden landing bay of Outpost Acheron. It was a ship that flew no flag and bore no registry. It was as anonymous and as effective as the woman it had come to collect. General Eris Thorne, once again just Dr. Thorne to any outside observer, walked across the ferrocrete toward the ship's ramp. She carried no luggage, only her datapad. Lieutenant Rostova stood at a respectful distance, seeing her off not as a subordinate, but as a witness. Aris paused at the foot of the ramp and looked back, not at Rostova, but at the mountain itself, the great mass of rock that she had tamed. Her face was, as always, unreadable. Then she turned and disappeared into the shadowed interior of the ship. Moments later, it lifted off without a sound and vanished into the gray, subterranean sky of the rift. She left behind an outpost that was forever changed. She left a crew that now understood the difference between authority and power. And she left a legend that would be whispered in the quiet corridors of command for years to come. The story of the ghost of Cygnus, the quiet professional who listened to the groans of a planet and, when the time came, taught it a new song. She was a force of pure, dispassionate logic in a universe governed by ego and chaos. She did not seek glory or command. She sought solutions, and when she found them, she simply moved on to the next problem. A silent, eternal guardian patrolling the unseen frontiers of a war no one else even knew was being fought.